plans. It only ever does that when it's really inconvenient. I might kick off. Welcome to everyone who is online today. I have a lot of slides to get through. I tried to do some culling, but it's a bit tricky with a topic as big as negotiation. So what we're going to do is we're going to run through, I guess, just some elements of things that you need to consider, both in preparing for a negotiation and then also obviously then doing one as well. This is something that I've been talking with our members about for many years now, and it's probably the first time that I have done this in a remote way rather than in a room full of people. So I've taken out a lot of the practical sort of practice sessions in it, but we'll just have to see how we go. There are some interactive elements to it. There's some polls that I will hopefully get to work. But if you can put any questions or comments in the notes as we go in your comments, and then Brooke can alert me to them, and we'll get through what we can. But thank you very much for coming along, and we're very excited to be able to do this on a more regular basis this year. That's one of our goals, particularly in light of our growing young professional membership cohort. These are the sorts of skills that you don't necessarily learn in your uni degree, but can be incredibly beneficial to have under your belt and in your toolkit as you progress through your career. So well done for spending your lunch break with us today doing something more productive than scrolling Instagram. You're better people than me. So for those of you who I don't know, my name is Alycia Vasilangos. I am now back to my substantive role of Principal Industrial Officer. I know probably many people who are online, but if I've not met you, I've been at the LGEA and Professionals Australia for too long now, 15 years or so. But a big part of my job is negotiating our state award in local government every 3 years that covers 40,000 employees. So over the last 15 years, I've picked up a trick or two in terms of how we negotiate, and I'm delighted to be able to share some of that information with you today. So as I said, we're going to talk a little bit about, I guess, the basics around negotiation, the sorts of things, the different types of negotiations that we do, the different ways we might negotiate, and then some tips on preparing and then actually undertaking the actual negotiation as well. So now I can't see any of my Zoom controls. Brooke, are you able to put a poll up? Because you're co-host, there should be one there on negotiation. Doesn't really matter. This is the reason that I was.
Is there just the one poll?
Yeah, but there's lots of questions. So can you run one question, then exit it, and then come back? Does it work like that?
I'm not sure, but let's give it a go. So when I launch it, I think all the questions are going to be available though.
Oh, right.
Anyway, let's just go with it.
Cool. So the first question we're going to be asking people is, what is negotiation? And the options are a fair and equal transaction, compromising, making a joint decision in which you get some of what you want and the other person gets some of what they want. You can see people answering them. Awesome. Well, I might talk to this whilst people are still doing it. Really only looking at the first question at this point, but I understand it's confusing. This is me showing my Zoom ineffectiveness. But yeah, what is negotiation? Is it a fair and equal transaction? Look, negotiation is fair, but it's seldom equal. We talk about, when we talk about negotiation, there are so many elements to consider, but one of the key elements, certainly as young professionals, is the power balances between the two parties, and that comes down to the relationships. So it isn't always an equal transaction. Is it compromising? Ideally, no. We negotiate to deliver on interest, but not to compromise. As a joint decision, the agreement must be acceptable to both you and better than the available alternatives. So if it isn't, there's no future in compromising. If I just give up what I want in order to reach agreement, then it's not really a negotiation. So negotiation is a joint decision. It's a decision that you make and a resolution that you agree to with another party or parties, so that you get some of what you want and the other party gets some of what they want. It's a bit of a game, to be honest. And if you're good at it, you'll go far. The most talented employee doesn't always get paid the most, for example, but the best negotiator will. So becoming a good negotiator is learning the rules and how to play by them. But the important factor to remember is it's an interactive process. So I might come in with a perfect script, but the person who I'm negotiating with doesn't have a copy of that script. So if they do something unexpected or something that I hadn't planned for, that will then leave me a little bit at sea, and I won't have an opportunity to come back to it and come back to my script. So it's an interactive process. That means each person's actions influence the actions of another person. It's not fluid. It is fluid. It's not a static process. And it's always changing. I might just put that poll down now for a minute, so I'll just end it. When do we negotiate? All the time. All the time, and in really small ways that don't necessarily matter. Like, I had a negotiation with both of my daughters today about how they were going to wear their hair for their PWSA tryouts at school. And then the really big stuff, negotiating salaries for job offers. They're two things that I've done today, and it's 12 o'clock. So it's a constant process of interacting with another person or persons. And what I've tried to do today is to talk about all the various ways that we negotiate. I think it's really easy when we talk about these things to frame it purely in the terms of negotiating for a pay increase, because that's something that everyone can relate to. But quite often the negotiations that you're undertaking in your jobs aren't just those once a year just sort of discussions around your pay. It's that constant sort of ongoing negotiation with colleagues and managers and supervisors around asset levels and who has the responsibility for a particular task and timeframes and deadlines and budgets. It's a process that we're all engaged in a lot more than we think. It's not just buying a house or buying a car. Who do we negotiate with? Well, as I've said, almost everyone, all of the day long, from your toddlers to your mother-in-law, to your colleagues, to your boss, to the person at the cafe who doesn't want to take your complicated coffee order. It's a constant process of interacting with people, and that makes it so complicated because, as we all know, people aren't always predictable and they don't always follow the same rules that we follow. When we talk about a negotiation, I've sort of tried to put a bit of a framework in that we will come back to as we talk about all the different stages. These are the 7 key elements of a negotiation that are important to think about, both in your preparation and also in the process of actually undertaking the negotiation and then in the finalization of the agreement. The elements to a negotiation are the relationships at play, the communications or communication styles, the interests on the table, the options available, the standards or criteria, the alternatives, and the commitments. They're the 7 key elements to any negotiation, and each one is integral to what the resolution of the negotiation will be. So if we talk first about relationships, we talk about relationships both between the person that you are negotiating with, but also the relationships that you have that relate to the negotiation and the relationships that the person you're negotiating with has. So if I'm negotiating around who has to do the next stationery order, the relationship that I have with the person I'm negotiating with, let's say it's Brooke, is important. So what we know about that relationship is that our relationship is ongoing and continuous. So it will impact the way I communicate with Brooke. I can't go in guns a-blazing because we still have to work together. It's also relevant that the relationships that I have within my team and the relationships that Brooke has within her team as well, as to how we then come to each other. What's the power balance between the two people? Is there a risk to a relationship if I interact with Brooke in a certain way? So this is quite an important part of preparing for negotiation. And it also is part of, it varies in terms of how we approach it depending on the types of negotiations that we have. So when we talk about types of negotiations, almost every negotiation can fit within the hard category and the soft category. The hard category is something like where there's lots of conflict, but not much in terms of an ongoing continuous relationship to manage. Negotiating to buy a house, for example. It doesn't matter to an extent how rude you are or how hard-nosed you are with the vendor in terms of haggling over the price, because ultimately you probably won't have a relationship with that person again afterwards. A soft negotiation is where you have to be soft because there are those relationships at play that are relevant and important and ongoing. So within your family unit, within your team, within your strata, if you live in strata living, places where you have that ongoing continuous relationship, negotiating with your kid's teacher, for example. So I have another poll here, Brooke, it's the same poll, but it's the rest of the questions.
Okay, let me try again. I don't know if the first one worked, but let's try.
It worked for me because I saw the results.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
So let's start at question 2. If you need to answer one to keep going, then you do. Do we think buying a house or a car is a hard or a soft? So I can see here, I think I've actually given you the answer for that one. Buying a house is definitely a hard type of a negotiation. It's one where it doesn't matter what happens with the relationship afterwards. You can go in guns a-blazing, and that's how it goes. A delegation of duties within your team, yeah, absolutely, that's right. It is a soft it's a soft type of negotiation because of the ongoing type of relationship and how that then impacts the approach that you take to the negotiation. If we break down hard and soft a bit further, there's another further sort of 5 categories that we can look at when we talk about different types of negotiations that we might find ourselves in. Adversarial. So this is a classic sort of hard type of negotiation where there's a polarization, opposite views. In this type of negotiation, it can feel like you need to sort of come in armed and armored, well defended and prepared to fight. Consensual, that's a team model. So in this type of negotiation, there has to be some give and take, a cooperative sort of working out of strategy, roles and rewards. Non-adversarial, which is quite similar to consensual in a way. It's where everyone has an interest in making it work. So there can't be a winner or a loser. Everyone has to sort of come up with a solution together. That's debate in these sorts of negotiations normally revolves around what's the best way to arrive at a mutually agreed outcome. So everyone knows what the outcome needs to be, but it's more about how do we get there. Brainstorming, negotiation, this type of negotiation, people sort of throw around ideas to see what's there, what needs to be done and who is to do what. So, you've got a project how do we address this project? How do we tackle it? And diplomatic negotiation, that's where you have those sensitive issues that need to be handled sensitively and with confidentiality and those sorts of things. So the first one on the poll is, what's bargaining? What do you think? If I'm going into a bargain with an employer to negotiate a new enterprise agreement in the workplace, what type of negotiation do you think that is? Adversarial, consensual, non-adversarial, brainstorming, or diplomatic? I should say that there's not necessarily one answer for this. So I can already see in the results that consensual is, most people have chosen consensual. Then we've got some people selecting adversarial and then some people selecting not adversarial. And to be honest, one negotiation or bargain actually will often ride those peaks and troughs quite a bit. I will say, if you approach a bargain with an employer from an adversarial point of view, you very rarely reach resolution because no one wants to be the loser. And so you find yourself, that's often where you get those stuck points where no one's willing to move on their claims. And often you need to seek the assistance of a commission or conciliation process to try and move a party along. Because ultimately, if you win everything and the employer loses everything, it's very unlikely that you're going to get an enterprise agreement made. Consensual and non-adversarial, they're probably the two that I would say. Non-consensual is everyone is probably quite commonly known as the interest-based bargaining model, where we all sort of agree on our claims or our goals, and then we try and find a way to get a resolution to something that includes everyone getting their interests met. Non-adversarial is quite similar, so well done. Performance issues. Adversarial, consensual, non-adversarial, brainstorming, or diplomatic. So again, we've got a real mix of responses here. Some people have said that performance issues are adversarial. Some people have said consensual, and some people have said diplomatic. So diplomatic is true. There's often sensitive issues that need to be handled when we're talking about performance stuff. Adversarial is often how you might react if you feel like you're being performance managed because you feel under threat, and we see it quite a bit. And then consensual is probably, again, the most likely sort of approach that I would find is a good type of negotiation model to fit this. So everyone has to reach the same resolution. Everyone has to walk away happy. But there has to be a sharing of ideas and a genuine collective approach to trying to resolve the issue. Project issues. Actually, there's overwhelmingly people have selected that project issues would be a brainstorming approach. There's also some people who have chosen non-adversarial approaches as well. Both of those, I think, would fit into either category, but you can all probably think of a time when you might have had an adversarial type of negotiation over a project issue. And you might also find that you've had instances where a diplomatic negotiation has been had over a project issue where someone's stuffed up or, and then you need to be quite sensitive around how that approach is handled and managed within a team environment. So these are the different types of ways we negotiate. And I think it's quite clear if we reflect on it that the relationships between the people that you're negotiating with have a really big impact on how those negotiations are handled. Okay, so I'm going to close that poll now. And so let's come back to our elements of a negotiation. So we've talked about the relationships and how the interplay between the parties and the relationships that they have and whether those relationships are ongoing can impact the approach to the negotiation. Let's talk now about communications, because the way that we communicate has a huge impact on the success of a negotiation. And I think a big part of the preparation for a negotiation is to consider your own communication style and to try and consider the style of the person you're going to negotiate with too, if it is someone who is known to you. And that comes down to that question of responsibilities and relationships. So communication styles, aggressive. People who are an aggressive communicator will often characterize their approach with using accusations, a lot of finger pointing, not necessarily literal, but often it is. They will often shift focus from taking responsibility to blaming. I think everyone here has probably had an instance of having a negotiation or a discussion with someone who has an aggressive communication style. It rarely ends in a win for the person, and it generally draws a negative response. You should try and avoid aggressive behavior in all stages of negotiations. And often what you'll find is if someone begins to approach a negotiation in an aggressive style, you will then automatically react in an aggressive way. So it isn't always fist banging and finger pointing, but it is, I think, characterized largely by blaming and sort of shifting focus from any responsibility for the person and suggesting that that responsibility lies with other people. Assertive communications. This is the one, obviously, that we would all know is the goal. So people who use assertive communication techniques often communicate their feelings in a true way and receive better hearing from that. It enables you to communicate without coming across in a threatening or overbearing manner. Being assertive requires you being firm, but also still demonstrating your understanding for others' needs or interests. It helps you have create a solid foundation for a better working relationship if it's a work-related negotiation. But it also is really important because it allows you to demonstrate where your boundaries are, which is a key part of having a successful negotiation as well. So, for example, I've just found out that Matt is paid more than me and I feel like my work and efforts here are not valued. I would appreciate an opportunity to discuss this with you from an aggressive standpoint. Why are you paying Matt more? That's not fair. You should be paying me more. I'm worth more money. So you can see the difference already. Submissive or passive communication styles is equally as dangerous as an aggressive approach in a negotiation. People that are submissive generally rely on charitable reactions to make any gains, and typically don't attract a lot of respect in the workplace. It's so important to avoid resorting to this style. People who are submissive or passive are often regarded as doormats. People don't necessarily have respect for them or won't turn to them in instances where they need a strong set of hands to help solve a problem. So if we talk about that same pay relativity issue, I know that you like Matt more, and that's okay, but I wish I just got paid more too. No one's going to reach into their pocket and pay that person more money. It's not going to work. So we talk about our communication styles. How do you know what your communication style is? It's important to think about your natural style, be aware of it, and to then try and adapt and change. But that's something that it's going to take you some time to sort of process. So I would suggest asking a close friend or a colleague or someone who you think like, hey, what sort of communication style do you think that I have? And then when you're aware of it, you can practice it. I won't get anyone to do this out loud because it's a bit tricky with so many people online, but have a look at this scenario here. So the scenario is during a meeting with some contractors, your boss interrupted you to correct what you were saying. It was highly embarrassing, especially as you saw the contractors sort of raise their eyes at each other as your boss was pointing out your errors. I feel like most people have had some form of experience in this sort of a scenario. How do you address that? be very easy to say, oh, you made me feel awful and I'm really upset about that. But is that an assertive approach? So when you are practicing assertiveness, you have to think about describing the problem, describing your reaction, and then proposing a solution. And you want to do that without leveling blame. That's the trickiest bit. I give you a minute to have a think about how you do it, and then I'll read you what I think is the best example of how to address it assertively. All right. So as an example, you might say, when I was corrected in front of those contractors, I felt like I was being made a public example of. In the future, if you need to correct me, I would prefer it if that could be done privately to give me an opportunity to address those issues whilst also saving face in front of contractors that are important to us. So the reason that that's an example of an assertive statement is it describes what the problem is, your feelings, and proposes a solution to it. That's a really important element to these sorts of discussions and negotiations. And it will draw a different reaction, as I said, than if you simply said, you made me feel like an idiot in front of those contractors. Who the hell do you think you are? That sounds like very exaggerated, but it's not. I've seen those sorts of instances in the workplace before. None of this is going to necessarily be really easy and natural to anyone, but it is something that is really helpful to have in your mind and be aware of, particularly in interactions where you have the opportunity to prepare. And as Bede has put in the chat, a really good way to do this is to ask your mentor about what your communication style is, if you're lucky enough to have a good mentor in your workplace, and have it as something that you then are conscious of and that you practice in all your interactions in the workplace, so that when it comes to the big ones, you're sort of a bit more well-versed. So in my view, probably the most important part of a negotiation or negotiating is planning. We don't always get the opportunity to plan for a negotiation. Sometimes they happen completely unexpectedly. But there are enough of them out there where we do know what to expect, or we do know that they're coming up. And planning is a huge element to get right, because if you get it right, your chances of success are much, much higher. So if we come back to the elements of a negotiation and the things that we need to think about when we're planning for a negotiation, we are now up to the interests. So when we talk about a negotiation, what are interests and how do they compare to options? So interests are the end product of the needs, concerns, goals, hopes, and fears that motivate the negotiating party. So you have a whole bunch of things that are important to you, and the interests are what you bring to a negotiation, your desired outcomes or the things that you hold most important. Positions are something that we decide, and interests are the things that cause us to make that decision. Interest-based bargaining, for example, is something that is becoming very, very common in negotiation of enterprise agreements and awards, because arguably the research suggests that if you come with interest as opposed to positions or claims, it is easier to have a consensual approach to trying to find an outcome where everyone's interests are met. Common interests are why we negotiate, and conflicting interests are what determines the content or the content of our negotiation. So our common interests are, if we talk about a bargaining example, common interests are we want everyone in the workplace to be happy. We want to retain existing staff and make our workplace an attractive place to work, because it's an interest for the employer to have a well-staffed organisation. It's an interest for an employee to have lots of resources to draw on to do their work. The conflicting interests are, I want a 15% pay increase and the organisation wants to cut costs. And that's then what determines the content of the negotiation. Until we know the interests of both or all sides, we don't know the extent to which interests are shared or opposed. So in planning for a negotiation, it's really important to get clear in your head what your interests are, and then how that determines what your options are. So it's very rare that you go into a negotiation with only one option available to you. You might have one key interest, but that interest might be met by various different types of options. The more options that we have, the more likely we are to be able to construct an agreement. And if we can't reach agreement on substantive issues, then we have to think about, well, can we agree on a process to deal with those issues? And if we kind of get unconditional agreement on everything, can we get a contingent agreement where we agree to some things, and then what's the process for moving on to those afterwards, or how do we address them at a later date? So when you're preparing for a negotiation, you have to have a clear structure to the claims that you have and your priorities, which are effectively the options that come from the interest that you have. In preparing, you should never assume that the party you're negotiating with will understand your needs and wants. And you should really approach this almost like a bit of an essay, to be honest. You need to sit down and go, I need to determine what it is that I want out of this. I want to have a think about what the other party wants, and I have to have a think about, if this is my ask, what am I going to say to justify that? If you can't write down what you expect to achieve from a negotiation, you can't expect that someone else is going to understand it or agree to it. One thing I always like to say to members when we're talking about preparing for a negotiation, and this might be a negotiation over a pay rise or a performance issue, the messaging is still the same, and that is to make sure that you don't use unnecessarily technical language. Almost explain things to people like they have no idea what your role is. Sometimes they don't. For example, if you're negotiating with HR, they don't necessarily understand what duties and responsibilities your role has. So be really, really clear on using clear language. Don't use unnecessary technical jargon, and make sure that you have all your options available to you in terms of your preparing process. So sit down and think about, what are my paths available? What is it that I want? How can we get there? And then do a bit of a SWOT analysis. If we want to use the pay rise example, what are the strengths of my claim for a pay rise? My personal performance. What are the weaknesses of my pay rise claim? Maybe things that I haven't achieved, or maybe there are errors that I've made. Your strengths and weaknesses of a pay rise are often the internal factors, and your opportunities and threats are often external factors. So the opportunities for your pay rise claim might be, maybe council's doing really, really well. And maybe you've also got a heap of vacancies. And so from that perspective, that should give you a bit of an opportunity to justify that pay increase. The threats might be, well, the economy is not doing great, or there's new people coming in that are going to have pay rises too, and so that might be a threat to your pay rise claim. They're the first steps that you need to do when you are undertaking a negotiation, is that you need to think about all of those things before you even start the process. We talked about options before, but when we talk about options, we talk about having some ambit in the things that you then specifically ask for. What's a win? look like? And then what's the difference between what you're asking for and what's the absolute bottom line? Anyone who's haggled in a market knows that you don't always put your final price forward first. And it's, I think, a very delicate balancing act to setting an ask that is perhaps above your bottom line, but not so high that the person isn't interested in engaging with you at all. So that's called your ambit. What's that fat that you've built into your claim? And what is the bottom line? So my claim is that I'd like to do a university degree and have it completely funded by my organisation. If they say no, and that is my bottom line, then I've got nowhere to go. Maybe my bottom line is I would like a fully funded university degree. But if it's not fully funded, then maybe they pay 50% and I get study days. So it's important to have a really clear consideration of knowing what you're asking for and what you'll settle for, again, before we start this process. And we do this all the time. Then we talk about options. So what are you going to do if you can't reach agreement? And this is, again, where those elements of the relationship elements and the communication styles really come into play. So, we use the hard negotiation of buying a house or a car. That's a transaction-based negotiation. What do you do if you can't reach agreement? You can walk away. Doesn't matter. Relationship-based negotiation, so those in the workplace, you can't walk away from them. I mean, you could, but then I don't know that that's maybe not the win that you're looking for if you have to go and find a different role. But that then determines what your options are. Is, well, if I have to keep working with this person, I have to think about what my real options are and what my real bottom lines are. BATNA. A BATNA is your best alternative to a negotiated agreement. So we talked about before the example of a university degree. I want to do a university degree. I want it fully funded. Employer says no. Maybe I say, okay, well, about 50% funding and 5 days of study leave. They still say no. Do I have a BATNA there? I don't know. Maybe I do. Maybe I say, okay, well, how about instead of a full degree, I'll do a diploma or a graduate certificate, or why don't you let me do this one subject and then we'll revisit it. It's really important. And again, why planning is such a key aspect of whether or not you'll succeed in negotiation is to be able to have all of that prepared before you go in. So you're not then put on the spot. Because what is a terrible outcome is if you then are put on the spot and you don't have a BATNA in your back pocket and you make a commitment to something that you're not actually willing to do, or you say you're going to quit and then you walk away and the next day you think, oh my God, no, I don't have a job. You have to think about what your realistic options are, and you have to be really real with yourself about what they are. So if it's pay rise, what are my options? They say no, I can look for another job, I can resign, I can sulk, I can put up with it, or I can do something else. Maybe my something else is, okay, but I want another discussion in 6 months, or I want an additional week of leave if you can't afford to pay me more. That is what a BATNA might look like. Be creative. And then think about those common, conflicting, and continuous elements, because those are the things that will help you get the person you're negotiating with on board. What are the common elements here? A pay rise example, we work in the same industry, we both want money and success, we want the organisation to do well. What are the conflicting elements? I want more money, they don't want to spend more money. What are the continuous elements? Our relationship are the continuous elements. So that will moderate our behaviour when we determine which is more important, the common elements or the conflicting elements or interests. So once you've sort of mapped out all of these parts, then you need to prepare your argument. So this is all before you've even sort of written your script. Preparing your argument, you want to identify supporting arguments or things that you can use to justify what it is that you're asking for. So sticking with the salary negotiation example, relativities, market data, special skills, responsibilities, or any other factual argument. When you're preparing your argument, it's really important to think about what it is that you are asking for and then put it in terms of how they can't afford not to agree to it. So me asking for a salary increase, the big sell isn't, I'm going to be really happy if you pay me more because my groceries are really expensive. The big sell might be progression is good because I will continue to work harder, and it will also send a message to the people around us that there are progression opportunities within this organization that will motivate people to continue to increase productivity. It's really important to quantify your achievements and focus your argument on what you've achieved for the person you're negotiating with, not what you personally have learned or grown, but what you've achieved for them. And if we stick with the salary negotiation example and noting that the majority of our members online are young professionals, at the beginning of your career, there's a much stronger claim for an increase as the growth is typically sort of more exponential at the beginning of your career. So keep that in mind at this point because you do find that there's sort of rapid growth in those sort of first periods of your career as a professional. When you're preparing your argument, the other part of that is to predict the response of the person you're negotiating with. So how will they respond? Try and think of the responses they might give and prepare what you might say in response or in a rebuttal. And just like you do a SWOT of your claim, you can also do a SWOT from the person's perspective. So I'm asking for a pay rise. I put a SWOT from my perspective, and then I think about how my boss might also do a SWOT analysis of that claim. So what are the strengths and weaknesses for them in giving me more money? What are the opportunities and threats for giving me more money? You'll find that when you're negotiating with someone, and I have to say I've seen this in many, many different types of negotiations that I've had, if you are able to articulate during discussion their viewpoint, you'll get them on side. So often when I'm negotiating with an employer, I will take the time to say, look, this is what we're asking for. I understand that you are having a difficult time financially, blah, 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 blah. Like I sort of cut off the argument before it could be made. It shows understanding. It also demonstrates assertiveness. Like I know what your boundary or your difficulties are, but I'm still going to ask for it because this is why. So it is really helpful to sort of try and frame some of your argument with an acknowledgement of the sorts of responses that they're likely to give. Consult. So if we are talking about a pay rise, please call the LGEA, talk to your delegate or talk to the industrial officer or organizer and get some advice. A reminder that if it is a pay rise, we run a biennial remuneration survey report with probably the most up-to-date and accurate data on local government professional salaries in New South Wales. It is widely used, it is available for members, and it is an incredibly valuable resource for you when you are talking pay. It's really helpful though to consult with someone before you do a negotiation. If you have the time, we don't always have all this time, but in doing that, you'll often uncover a weakness in your argument. We've all done the thing where we play devil's advocate with someone. It might be over a relationship thing, over a beer, where we sort of say, oh, this is what they've said. And you might have a friend say, oh, well, in fairness, or, have you thought about it from their perspective? There's huge value in consulting and practicing sort of the key points before you then go through the process. And it's just a friendly reminder that the LGA is available to help you with any sort of thing that is work related, in terms of if it's sort of salary or performance related. You can always contact the LGA to get some advice from us, and then your local delegates and mentors are also there to assist. Once you've undertaken all of this, you just make your argument. Just off you go. And in doing so, you want to say what you want, why you want it, how it can be granted, and when you want it to be effective. So create a logical structure and stick with it. It seems so simple to just put it like that. But so often we will see certainly members contact us and they've sort of ticked off 3, but they haven't ticked off 1. And then that's been the confusion where things have come unstuck. The when is really important, that time frame, because without a when, it's very easy for the person you're negotiating with to go, yeah, we'll do that. And nothing ever actually then gets locked in. So it's really important to consider just those 4 elements. And as I said before, essay plan it, like write it out, have a piece of paper, have a cheat sheet, and make it really clear in your head so that you then can't deviate from that and end up in a situation where you've agreed to something that you then immediately regret. Making your argument. Think of the things that you have in common and what you don't have in common. So we talked about, those interests, identify their interests, talk about the interests that you have, those common interests. Don't be afraid to have those conflicting interests ventilated as well, especially if you then can come up with a solution to that, because that is effectively the negotiation process. Work through issues that you haven't agreed on when you're negotiating. Propose alternatives. That's why having those BATNAs sort of prepared in advance is very helpful. So you can on the fly go, okay, well, they've said no to that. What's my second option? And make strategic concessions where necessary, if necessary. But don't get caught up in stalling tactics and spend the whole time sort of talking through things that aren't really important just to build rapport. It's important to go into these sorts of discussions where everyone sort of feels comfortable and relaxed, but don't spend the whole time doing that. Build a bit of rapport and then go in with your ask. During negotiations, try not to preach, react emotionally, dominate the discussion. It's very easy to fall into a trap with someone where you feel nervous often. And so you just talk and talk and talk and talk and talk and talk and talk. Don't be put off by silence. Don't be afraid of silence. Try not to involve others in any negotiations. This is particularly important when we're talking pay or when we're talking performance issues. You very easily risk falling into aggressive or passive submissive styles when you start to involve other people, unless you have prior approval or it is really contingent on the discussion. Don't make accusations and don't make threats or say something you won't be able to live with later. That is, again, very unlikely to happen if you have done the prep work where you've got those options all mapped out ahead of time. Another thing to try not to do is to say point blank no's. So that's not saying you have to agree to everything, but if you say no, there's nowhere to go. So think about trying to explore options put to you in a way that shows openness and willingness to discussion, unless there is something that you just point blank can't agree to. But often you'll find that if you can sort of explore it, the conversation will flow more and more options will go, rather than if you just say no, then nothing further happens. What do you want to try and do? Listen more than you talk. Try to be understanding of the interests of the other person. Try and stay calm and focused on your goal. Just on that, if you're not feeling calm and you're feeling flustered and you can feel yourself sort of deviating into an aggressive style because you feel under threat, you can always ask to pause a discussion. Don't soldier through something that you can feel sinking. If you need to take 5, if you need to ask to revisit it, if you need to come back with a support person, you can always ask to have a break. Try and be flexible. And again, this is contingent on having had that prep work done. Always take notes and always sum up at the conclusion to review decisions. I cannot tell you how often that last element doesn't occur. There is no point going through the whole process if the only evidence of that at the end is that you both sort of walk out of the meeting and nothing happens. So at the end, always do a wrap up. So following the discussions today, what we have resolved is that Sue is going to take responsibility for that defect. Sharma's going to report back on a time frame and contact the contractors, and Bobby's going to organise a meeting with the internal staff. If those discussions are not, if there's no sum up and wrap up at the end of a discussion, then it's not worth the air that you've used to have the conversation, because there's no evidence. A verbal discussion can't be sort of revisited or reopened. It's really, really important to sum up at the conclusion. So as I said, sum up at the end of the discussion and then make sure you put it in writing afterwards. It's so important to have that written feedback and the written communication. It's a really good practice to get into really early on in your career, because it is so valuable. And I multiple times a week, this comes up for us in terms of our discussions with our members. Oh, okay, so you had a discussion and this was the outcome. Yes, okay. Do you have any evidence of that? No. Always summarize agreements in writing and identify what the agreement entails, who is affected, when it will be implemented, who needs to do what, and then obviously thank the other party for their part in the process. Send the email, keep a copy of it on file. Even better if the person responds acknowledging that that's their understanding of the position as well. If they don't respond, send a follow-up. But there's no point going through all of these processes if at the end you don't have a written summary of what's been agreed to. I can't stress that enough. So that's that. Go forth and off you go. I've just really covered the elements today. And the way that we're doing this is an introduction to negotiation skills. So there will be an advanced one run at a little bit later where we'll be able to delve a little bit deeper and probably try and do some breakout rooms where we do some practicing, because that is obviously, no one gets better at negotiation by listening to me talk for an hour. That's part of it, but a lot of it is done in practice and in undertaking it in a practical sense. Does anyone have any questions? I can see a couple of things in the chat. Oh yeah. Yes, Bede, that's a great point. Yeah, making sure that during the negotiation to confirm that understanding. And then Robert's asked, is there a chance to get a copy of the presentation slides? So Brooke, do you want to talk about what we're going to do in relation? Oh, you have. Yes, we can share the slides. So we are going to put a copy of this up. It's going to be available, I think, on our website. Brooke, did we work out the logistics of?
Yeah, so what we'll do is we'll put it up. The recording will be available on the member portal. And then there'll also be a version on our website for non-members to access, but it will be gated. So they'll need to just fill out some details for us. That should be going up sometime this week, but we can definitely share the slides because I know I've taken a few screenshots of things to remember. So we
Okay.
can definitely share the slides around with everyone who's attended.
That's great. Excellent. Well, if there are no further questions or comments, thank you very much for coming along today to what we hope will be a fairly regular thing where we will do these every couple of months. We'll also be supplementing them with some fact sheets that we're putting together to try and upskill our young professional members to put you in the best place possible to see some great career progression for you in the workplace. But thanks everyone for coming along, and have a fabulous Tuesday.